When it comes to tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, Call of Cthulhu, Pathfinder, and what have you, there are a lot of things that both the players and the dungeon masters carry that will be equal. Stuff like books, paper, and most importantly, dice. But arguably the biggest advantage that dungeon masters have over players from these three things is the capability to fudge their dice rolls. If you don't know what fudging means, it's when a dungeon master takes a die, rolls it, and then tells you the result that you got. However, the result they tell you is not the result they rolled. They've altered it without you knowing. Now, dice rolls are, of course, already altered by a number of different factors. It could be ability checks, it could be saving throws, it could be any factor that would increase or decrease the number naturally. However, fudging is what happens when you just artificially increase that number. For example, let's say I'm in a combat scenario and I really want to do some damage to my players. They've been doing extraordinarily well, but I want them just to feel a little bit. I roll an attack for one of my NPCs and they rolled a 2. They have a +3 to hit, which makes that total of 5. However, I look at my player and I say, sorry, he rolled a 14, which does hit the AC. I have now lied to the player and I did not give them an accurate number for what they rolled, and now I have fudged my dice roll. You're probably in one of two camps right now. You're either in the camp of, that's a great idea, I have more control over the dice and I can shape the narrative towards what I want and don't want. That's brilliant, that's perfect, and they would never know because of the Dungeon Master screen. Or you're in the other camp, where you're just blatantly calling that cheating and misguidance and just all around not fun. And maybe some of you are somewhere in between, where you're okay with doing it some of the time, but not all of the time, depending on when the narrative needs it. This is where the vast majority of dungeon masters tend to sit, is right in that middle ground of only fudging sometimes, but not often enough that it becomes noticeable. And I find it's quite often newer dungeon masters who tend to fudge more often than experienced dungeon masters who fudge less often. From my own understanding, I think it may just be coming from inexperience from new dungeon masters worried about telling a good story, so they fudge the dice rolls in order to shape the story a little bit more in the way they want to tell it, versus experienced dungeon masters who are at the point where, fuck it, they can roll with whatever happens with the dice. So now let's address the title of the video. Should dungeon masters fudge their dice rolls? I'm of the mindset that I don't think a dungeon master should ever fudge their dice. Now don't get me wrong, there is a lot of pros to fudging dice. You can shape the narrative a lot easier. You can help newer players not get absolutely demolished if you roll natural 20s and crit them. You can shape encounters a lot easier instead of worrying about strictly numbers and shaping things overall. And you can essentially tie all of these down to that last point of shaping the narrative and having more control over your story. However, the biggest caveat to all these pros is this. The single moment a single one of your players finds out that you fudge your dice, all of these pros, just like that. Many years ago, I was in a Dungeons & Dragons game as a player for a rare sport of time, and the Dungeon Master and I were chit-chatting a little bit after one of the sessions, and they were telling me how they felt the session went and how I felt the session went. And while they were talking to me, they told me that a couple of the rolls they made they didn't like, so they had bumped the numbers a little bit to make the encounter more challenging because they thought it was too easy. The moment that Dungeon Master told me this, every session afterwards and every session that had happened before, I could never ever trust the Dungeon Master to be telling me the truth about the dice that he was rolling behind the screen. Think about it. You as a player are putting all of your trust in your storyteller, your dungeon master, to give you a fun experience and an enjoyable time at the table. And as soon as you find out that every time they're rolling a die over here and doing the math and calculating the results, and you know that they fudge the dice, will you trust every single one of those results? If a character rolls an attack against you and they exceed over your AC, do you believe they actually did? Or did he fudge his numbers? If you're squaring off a challenge against an NPC to maybe an arm wrestling competition, you roll a strength saving throw and you score extremely high. He rolls a strength saving throw. Sorry man, he rolled a 19. You know he fudges. Do you trust that he rolled a 19? And now suddenly all the pros of fudging dice has come crumbling down, and you can no longer trust your storyteller to properly tell you the story that is actually happening. Do you feel like you're earning your achievements? Do you feel like you're meeting your goals? You are rolling your dice, and your dice are out in the open for everyone to see. So anyone can look over at players and dungeon masters alike and see exactly the math that you're calculating. But your players, your fellow players, cannot do the same for the DM. You're just trusting him to be accurate and right for your benefit and your fun. And for me, trust between the players and myself is my biggest component. I want my players to have fun every time they sit down at the table, and I want them to have a memorable story to tell after every single session, and most importantly, I want them to trust me. And I've made it a point that anytime I roll anything drastic, like a natural 1 or a natural 20 or something extremely high, extremely low, or any moment in time, I roll the die and I do not touch it. I simply make the roll and I keep my hands up, I do my math, and I keep it far away from where I rolled that die. If a player wants to, I always let them look at the dice roll. If I roll a natural 20 and they go, no way, I go, you can look if you'd like, and I keep my hands where they can see them. And they will often look over the DM screen and nod to everybody else. He did in fact roll a natural 20, or he did in fact roll the number that he says he did. Another big important thing in terms of fudging dice rolls for me is that a large majority of this game revolves around dice. Dungeons & Dragons is heavily centered around the idea of dice rolling. Yes, there's a lot of other things that go into it, but if you took dice out of the game would fall apart so fast. Dice is a critical component to it, and that's what makes the game fun and exciting, rewarding, and challenging, because you cannot always predict what is going to happen. You, the player, cannot, and the Dungeon Master cannot. And as soon as the Dungeon Master starts fudging their dice rolls, there's no point for them to be rolling dice at all. If a Dungeon Master already knows that the next time they make this roll, they want it to be a strong hit, or they want it to be a weak thing, there's no point in rolling. You already know in your head that this is going to be strong. Don't bother rolling the die. Even if you roll a natural 1, you're going to tell them otherwise. Dungeons & Dragons is about rolling dice, and it's about random chance. If you are altering that randomness beyond the points of the game, there is never a point to roll again. If you're a newer Dungeon Master, I can absolutely see the ideals behind fudging your dice. The biggest pushback I've seen about fudging your dice is in respect to newer players. You don't want to absolutely squash a newer player in a brand new combat encounter because your enemy rolled a natural 20 and just slayed them. But I think if you talk to players before they sit down firsthand and you tell them that death is a very real thing and this game is very much about chance and luck as it is about the role-playing and combat aspect, I think they will be much more okay with the fact that I rolled a natural 20, that's going to do a lot of damage. And if you're a Dungeon Master who does fudge their dice rolls, or you want to fudge your dice rolls, then by all means, I cannot tell you what to do. I cannot tell you how to play your game. I can only give you the advice that I know firsthand from my experience and from what I've heard from other players and Dungeon Masters alike. But my biggest warning to you, if you do fudge your dice or you're considering fudging your dice, all the pros that go along with fudging your dice immediately wash away the moment your players suspect you're doing it, or worse, find out you're doing it. All your trust goes out the window, and you will have one fuck of an uphill battle trying to gain that trust again. What are your opinions on fudging dice? Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Or do you have a different opinion altogether? I would love to have a conversation about this in the comment section down below, or if you want to chat to me live, I'm on Twitch Tuesdays and Saturdays from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and you can chat with me there. And if you maybe want to get involved with the community and get a lot more other people's opinions, there's a Discord link down below where we have an active community of fantasy lovers just like yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you, my patrons, very much for supporting me, and I will see you all in the next video. Skål!